Hey folks, today I'm delving into another of Scotland's as of yet unexplained missing persons cases. That being the disappearance of James Paton, a 72-year-old man who seemingly disappeared into thin air during what should have been a routine dog walk in the Scottish Highlands. This case has intrigued and baffled the communities of Kiltarlity and Beauly for years, with no definitive answers ever emerging despite exhaustive search efforts. The investigation into James's disappearance has been defined by a total lack of physical evidence, which has created a lot of speculation. As someone who's covered several unusual disappearances now in Scotland, this one certainly meets the criteria we look for due to this complete absence of evidence and the circumstances surrounding it. James, known to his friends and family as Jim, was a resident of Kiltarlity, a small village in the Scottish Highlands near Inverness. Jim was approximately 5 feet and 8 inches tall, with a stocky build, grey hair, beard and glasses, and he was known as an independent individual who liked his routines. Living alone in a close-knit community, he was a familiar figure to the locals, often seen walking his spaniel collie Cross, whom he loved very much in familiar rural areas. Jim was particularly fond of Ruttle Woods, located on the south side of the River Beauly. It is characterised by some of its dense coniferous sections within. Also within the woods lies Tor Moor, a hill described as a tump, which is a hill with at least 30 metres prominence, and it is entirely covered by forest. This area, with its dense woodland, farm tracks and proximity to the river, was one of his regular dog walking destinations. The river itself features the Aegis Dam and can be hazardous due to steep banks, fast currents and seasonal weather conditions. This river is a substantial watercourse. It's wide and in winter can really get moving when the rain comes down. The dam controls water levels, and these fluctuations can make the banks fairly slippery and expose unstable sediment. When the dam releases water, it creates washouts and shifts heavy logs on the riverbed. In theory, that could trap a body and completely hide it from sight. The transition from woodland to riverbank can also be abrupt in places and concealed by vegetation. A slip on the bank and into the water below would obviously not be a great thing to have happen, especially in winter. Despite these potential dangers, Jim was experienced with the terrain, and as far as I'm aware, he typically stuck to established paths rather than venturing off trail. I've seen Jim described as a responsible person and a responsible dog owner. From reading about him, I get the sense that he wasn't exactly prone to impulsive behaviour. In these kinds of cases, there will often be statements made in the media about mental health challenges or cognitive decline, but in this instance, there is no mention of either. I'd have to imagine, given the frequency that these things are reported on, that there was no profound evidence of either in this case. Although, let's be honest, as we age, some kind of decline is sadly very likely to happen to all of us. There was also no evidence to suggest that he might have wanted to voluntarily disappear. This makes his sudden disappearance all the more baffling to those who knew him, and to the investigators who have worked on trying to understand exactly what happened that day. The events began on a winter afternoon that would become ingrained in the memory of the Highland community. The 23rd of December 2019, just 2 days before he would likely have been celebrating the festive season, started as an ordinary day for Jim, with no indication that it would end in being added to the list of Scotland's unexplained disappearances. Before we get into the details, if I could just ask you to like the video and hype it, then I would be very grateful. Now, the weather on the day of Jim's disappearance saw temperatures hovering around freezing later during the day. This would obviously create a high risk if someone, especially an older person, became immobilised somehow, particularly after sunset. While it was dry that day, it had been raining a lot in the days preceding it, meaning the ground within the forest will have been very wet and muddy due to the amount of downpour that the area had been exposed to. Shortly before 1:30 PM, Jim was captured on CCTV at a petrol station in Beauly. Stills from the footage, later released by police to aid the search, showed him appearing calm and purchasing a newspaper while dressed in weather-appropriate clothing. He was wearing some black trousers, a purple jumper, a green fleece jacket and brown boots. This stop seemed routine, with no indications of distress or unusual behaviour noted in reports. After leaving the petrol station, Jim proceeded to drive his Dacia Dustera, a compact SUV, towards Fenelon Farm Road, a rural track which I believe is this one, and it leads straight into Ruttle Woods, where he intended to walk his dog. Soon after 1:30 PM, there was a confirmed sighting by witnesses as they saw him driving onto this road and was close to his destination. At that time, there would have been around 2 hours of daylight left. This area is about 2 to 3 miles from his home back in Kiltarlity, which neighbours Beauly, and is popular among locals for dog walking due to its scenic but isolated nature. Weather conditions that day were a little milder for a Scottish winter, though it was still cold and overcast at the time, with short daylight hours, but no extreme storms or hazards were reported that might have immediately explained a mishap aside from the prior rainfall. Sunset occurred around 3:55 PM that day and saw total darkness at around 4:20 PM. In this situation, any delay, minor injury or deviation from the path would have made it basically impossible for him to have been able to see anything. Now, at some point between 1:30 and 4:30 PM, Jim must have failed a check-in through the phone or something along those lines because the police were contacted. Thankfully, Police Scotland reacted quickly, and by around 4:30 PM that same day, roughly 3 hours after his last sighting, Jim's car was found parked on a track near Upper Fenelon Farm, close to the initial sighting area and sitting in total darkness. The vehicle was unattended, though oddly his dog was found safe inside. This seems to allow for a few scenarios that have been thrown around and debated. The first idea I've seen put forwards is that Jim got out of the car and suffered from some kind of medical event before the walk actually got too far on its way. Though it seems to me you can mostly rule that one out, as if he was anywhere near the car, it's overwhelmingly likely that he would have been found. Although not impossible, I recently came across a disappearance where an elderly woman went missing a couple of years ago. She looks to have been in a neighbouring garden for the entire time until her body was found 2 years later thanks to Google Street View. I won't go too into that right now, other than to say, the point being, is that while you'd really like to think that if Jim was in close proximity to the car, then he would have been found. But clearly it doesn't always happen that way, even if the missing person is close to the starting point. The second idea is the completed walk or muddy boot theory. This suggests that Jim had completed the entire walk with his dog, returned to the car, and he put the dog inside to secure it. He then could have realised that his boots were muddy or that he needed the toilet. If such circumstances led him to the steep bank of the river, there could have been a slip which turned into a fall. However, the search dogs never tracked his scent to the river from the car, which I think is highly important. And that actually brings us to the third scenario, which is much stronger in my opinion, because notably, one of the car's windows had been left wide open, and there was a trail of mud on the exterior of the door. This could suggest that the dog may have been out with Jim and then re-entered the car on its own at some point, likely after becoming muddy during a partial walk with him. No signs of struggle, damage to the car, or personal items left behind were publicly detailed, though police later confirmed that there was no trace of Jim himself at the scene. I will just say that it's not clear if the window was open the entire time, meaning that Jim left it open when the walk began, or if Jim and the dog made it back to the car, then he opened it and something happened then. I would point this out too. These Spaniel Collie dogs are often referred to as Velcro dogs, as they seem to have a tendency to follow their owners everywhere. I think that comes from the Border Collie have, but I'm not really sure. If you have one of these dogs, feel free to butt in here and let me know. So, with that in mind then, that really could suggest that Jim, quite literally, was just not in the area anymore, and had somehow completely left it. If Jim entered the water, would you have expected the dog to have gone in too, or just be sitting by the spot that he went in? If Jim was on the ground somewhere in the forest, again, would you even have found the dog in the car, or would it have been sitting with him wherever he was? If Jim hadn't entered the water and was still completely gone, well, then you'd have to start invoking some very odd hypotheses. Now, I know many often point to the missing 411 criteria, and it's hard to ignore how many boxes Jim's case does technically check, as many as the other cases that I've covered recently. Hopefully, I will pop in some of the profile points that Jim's disappearance correlates with. I do get criticised sometimes for not highlighting and lingering on these ideas, but could it be possible that something so far out of the ordinary happened that we're just not familiar with? Sure, I don't think that we know everything about everything, and while that's not the starting point, I do at least appreciate how odd it is, quite literally statistically speaking too, when a person is just never found in this manner. Anyway, the discovery of the car and the dog obviously prompted immediate concern, as it was completely out of the ordinary for Jim to leave his dog unattended like this, and it was also dark at this point too. On the 24th of December, initial search efforts began, focusing on the vicinity of Ruttle Woods, Upper Fenelon and the River Beauly. To visualise the scene, the ground conditions at the time would have been saturated, consisting of slick mud and wet peat. Media outlets, including the BBC, reported on the case, noting the car's discovery, and they helped to appeal for public assistance. Searches intensified over the Christmas period, involving police dogs for scent tracking, the Dive and Marine Unit for underwater searches of the river, and support from the Scottish Fire Rescue Services, who got involved in the ground searches. The Dundonald Mountain Rescue Team, a Coast Guard helicopter, and local community volunteers also participated, covering rugged terrain, woodlands and water bodies. The dense canopy and lack of distinct landmarks can make disorientation easy. Thick tree cover in Ruttle Woods would have diminished the usefulness of FLIR-fitted helicopters and drones somewhat, which would be especially true if he found himself under a tree or in a hollow. If someone was suffering from confusion, an individual could wander in circles and accidentally become trapped in deadfall zones that would be very difficult to access. It is important to say though that despite the wet and muddy conditions, I don't believe that the search teams ever found any footprints or other evidence such as clothing or personal items on the ground. Given that it was wet and muddy, I can see how someone might point to the lack of footprints as also being odd. The search operation was said to have been highly extensive, with hundreds of volunteers joining professional teams in combing through the challenging highland terrain. By the 2nd of January 2020, police expressed increasing concern in public appeals, urging locals to check outbuildings, sheds or sheltered areas where Jim might have sought refuge if disoriented. On the 10th of January, images from the Beauly petrol station was released to the public via media outlets like the Ross-shire Journal, aiming to jog memories of potential witnesses who might have seen him en route or in the woods. Searches continued, including targeted dives in the river, but yielded no results. On the 23rd of December 2020, an entire year after the disappearance took place, police were no closer to finding him and renewed their call for public help. This was also supported by a family statement about Jim, where they said, "We miss Jim dearly and are extremely upset that a year has now passed with no signs of him." They thanked the community and hoped the outreach would prompt recollections of the day that he went missing. By this point, the entirety of the search efforts had been described as rigorous, involving multiple specialist units, but Jim remained missing. Before we get into the various hypotheses, I am curious to know if you've heard about Jim's disappearance before this video. I'd imagine that most outside of Scotland haven't, including myself, and I'd just like to thank Annette for telling me about this. But yeah, I'd be interested to know. In the years following Jim's disappearance, numerous lines of thought have emerged about what might have happened to him. Online discussions have compiled the timeline and speculated on various possibilities. It is just important to clarify first, like most of the disappearances that catch my attention, there is just no evidence of anything, and these are just speculations on that basis. One of the most widely considered hypotheses is that Jim accidentally fell into the River Beauly, where he came to pass away. The river, given its close proximity to Ruttle Woods and its hazardous conditions due to the Aegis Dam, certainly could present a real danger. The steep banks, fast currents and cold water, especially in December, could have quickly overwhelmed Jim if he'd fallen in. In theory, a person could have been moved a considerable distance in this river if it was flowing fast enough. In addition to that, as I've pointed out before on the channel, we are unfortunately hardwired to take in a deep breath of air when being submerged into cold water. As you can imagine, if your head also happened to be underwater at the time, well, you can see where that's going. The police must have thought that this was a strong possibility given their decision to deploy the Dive and Marine Unit early in the search. However, extensive underwater searches failed to recover any trace of him, making this theory less conclusive than it might otherwise be, since there is just literally no evidence whatsoever. Another possibility is that Jim suffered a medical emergency while walking his dog. At 72, he was in an age group where undiagnosed cardiac events are more common. Such an event could have caused him to become disoriented, collapse, or lose consciousness in an area where for some reason he couldn't easily be found. Given that the dog is literally called a Velcro dog, you'd imagine it might have stayed with Jim and wouldn't have left him to have been found later in the car. Maybe there is an argument to suggest that the dog returned to the vehicle on its own, sensing that something was wrong with Jim, and it sought the familiar safety of the car. Again, those with these kinds of dogs will know far more than I do here. The trail of mud on the car door does support the idea that the dog did exit and re-enter the car on its own. So, given the dog's return, perhaps that really does make something to do with the river the most likely scenario. Another issue with this line of thought too is that if such a medical event was taking place, coupled with Jim's age, you might expect that he wouldn't have gotten very far from the initial point that this took place. I can see why some people might conclude that he'd have been found if it had gone down this way, and subsequently, I can see why many would favour the idea that whatever happened to Jim, the end result was that he was simply just not in the area anymore. There isn't any evidence that has been publicly reported to suggest foul play. The car was found intact, with no signs of struggle reported near the vehicle, other than the mud on the door, which looks to have been left behind by the dog. It doesn't seem that anything had been stolen either. Furthermore, Kiltarlity and Beauly are low crime areas, making the likelihood of a random chance encounter like this statistically improbable, though certainly not impossible. The next idea simply suggests that Jim somehow became lost in the dense woodland of Ruttle Woods, and later succumbed to hypothermia or other injuries. The area is characterised by what I have seen described as phantom forest tracks. These are paths that appear on Ordnance Survey maps but don't exist on the ground. The terrain is also cluttered with fallen trees, creating difficult, uneven footing and visual obstructions. If this is what happened, there is a chance that Jim's green fleece jacket could have provided effective camouflage within the forest, making it significantly more difficult to see him, certainly from the air. I'd have to imagine that in a dense woodland like this, a stationary person wearing green is probably very hard to see unless you're very close. Again, perhaps you would have expected the dog to have stayed at his side in such a situation too, but I am not sure, and I'd prefer to hear from dog owners on that one. As of the current time, on the 24th of December 2025, Jim still remains officially missing, with no body or trace having ever been found at all. In the end, it's not really understood what happened to him, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Please do remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for the channel, and also to like the video and hype it if you can. I'd be very grateful, or a dislike if you disliked it. I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a really big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Be safe all, peace.